The geopolitical center of gravity in the 21st century is not a silicon chip factory in Taiwan or an oil well in Saudi Arabia. It is a rusty industrial port terminal in Odessa, Ukraine. If you stood on the docks in the early months of the war, looking out at the Black Sea, you would have seen something that terrified global strategists more than any tank battalion: silence. For centuries, this coastline served as the jugular vein of the global food supply. It is the exit point for the Black Earth region, the vast hyper-fertile steppe that stretches across Ukraine and southern Russia, possessing the unique ability to feed half the world. But when the Russian Navy mined the harbor and parked its frigates on the horizon, they didn't just blockade a country, they took the global calorie supply hostage. To understand why this moment changed the world, we must strip away the romance of agriculture and see wheat for what it actually is. In the eyes of the Kremlin, wheat is not a foodstuff. It is a weapon of mass destruction that moves in slow motion. It is yellow cake uranium that you can eat. Every government in the Middle East and North Africa knows the basic equation of survival. Cheap bread equals political stability. When the price of bread spikes, regimes fall. The Arab Spring of 2011 was triggered not just by a desire for democracy, but by a drought in the Black Sea region that sent grain prices soaring, forcing people into the streets. Vladimir Putin knows this history intimately. His strategy in Ukraine was never just about territory, it was about seizing the master switch of global hunger. This represents a stunning reversal of history. For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was a surprisingly fragile giant when it came to food. The communist system of collective farming was so inefficient that the USSR, despite possessing the best soil on Earth, was a net importer of grain. In 1973, in an event known as the Great Grain Robbery, the Soviet Union secretly bought 10 million tons of American wheat and corn to prevent domestic famine, driving up global prices and revealing their strategic weakness to Washington. The Cold War logic was that the West could always starve the Soviets into submission. Today, that polarity has flipped. Over the last 20 years, while the West focused on tech and finance, Moscow quietly invested billions into modernizing its agriculture. They privatized the land, built new terminals, and unleashed the potential of the Black Earth. By 2023, Russia had become the world's largest exporter of wheat, controlling nearly a quarter of the global trade. When you combine this with their occupation of Ukrainian farmland, effectively stealing the harvest of their competitor, Moscow now commands a share of the global grain market that rivals OPEC's control over oil. They have become the world's first food superpower. The weaponization of this power was immediate and ruthless. When the invasion began, Russia didn't just bomb military targets. They targeted silos, fertilizer plants, and tractors. They stole combine harvesters, which were later remotely disabled by John Deere, and burned fields. But the true strategic blow was the naval blockade. By sealing off the Black Sea, Russia trapped nearly 25 million tons of grain inside Ukraine. This was not collateral damage, it was a calculated siege, designed to send a shockwave of inflation across the global south. The impact was essentially a hunger tax, levied on the world's poorest nations. Countries like Egypt, which imports 80% of its wheat from the Black Sea, found themselves in a state of national emergency. In Lebanon, where the currency had already collapsed, subsidies for bread became unsustainable, leading to fights in bakeries. In Yemen and Somalia, where the line between survival and famine is razor-thin, the blockade was a death sentence. The Kremlin's calculation was cynical but effective. By manufacturing a food crisis, they could force the West to the negotiating table. They bet that the fear of mass migration from starving African nations would terrify European leaders more than the invasion itself. This leverage culminated in the cynically named Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by Turkey and the UN. This deal allowed Ukraine to export grain through a safe corridor, but Russia used the deal not as a humanitarian relief valve, but as a geopolitical throttle. They would agree to renew the deal for 60 days, then threaten to cancel it, then slow-walk inspections of ships, causing a backlog of hundreds of vessels. Every time they threatened to close the corridor, global futures markets spiked, and politicians in Cairo, Jakarta, and Lagos had to call Moscow to beg for mercy. It turned the daily bread of millions of people into a diplomatic bargaining chip. Furthermore, Russia began to redraw the map of alliances based on who gets to eat. We are witnessing the rise of grain diplomacy. While blockading Ukraine, Russia offered free or discounted grain to friendly nations in Africa, specifically those like Mali and Burkina Faso, where Russian-backed Wagner mercenaries were operating. They effectively told the global south, "The West sanctions us and makes you starve. Stick with us and we will feed you." It is a return to a feudal form of international relations, where food is a privilege granted by the lord of the steppe, not a commodity bought on the open market. The result is a new geography of famine. The world is dividing not just into democracies and autocracies, but into food-secure and food-insecure blocks. The wealthy nations of the West can absorb higher prices. We just complain about inflation at the grocery store. But for the developing world, the weaponization of wheat has exposed a terrifying reality. Their sovereignty is an illusion, as long as their food supply depends on the whims of a reventist power in the Kremlin. The Black Sea is no longer just a body of water. It is the most dangerous choke point on the planet, where the war for the future is being fought not with missiles, but with bushels. If the naval blockade of the Black Sea was the visible front of the food war, the second front was fought in the shadows, deep within the supply chains of modern industrial agriculture. It is a war not over the harvest itself, but over the ability to produce a harvest at all. To grow food on a planetary scale requires three specific chemical elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Without them, soil is just dirt. And it is here in the global fertilizer market that Russia holds an even more terrifying form of leverage than it does with grain. Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizers. It is the only country on Earth that is a dominant superpower in all three categories of nutrients. It sits on massive reserves of potash, mined in the Urals, vast phosphate deposits, and crucially, it has the world's cheapest natural gas, which is the primary feedstock for creating nitrogen fertilizer. This geological lottery win means that for farmers in Brazil, India, in large parts of Africa and Europe, the road to a successful harvest runs through Moscow. When the war began, the world experienced a fertilizer shock. Prices for key inputs tripled overnight. This didn't just hurt bank accounts, it physically altered the behavior of farmers across the globe. In West Africa, smallholder farmers who could no longer afford imported Russian fertilizer simply stopped using it. The result was a yield depression, a silent catastrophe where the same amount of land produced 30% or 40% less food. This is the insidious nature of the fertilizer weapon. It doesn't cause famine today, it engineers a famine for next year. It breaks the cycle of productivity that keeps 8 billion people alive. This dependency created a diplomatic phenomenon known as the fertilizer trap. Consider the case of Brazil. It is an agricultural giant feeding a huge portion of the world with its soy and corn. But Brazil imports nearly 85% of its fertilizer, and its biggest supplier is Russia. This biological reality forced the Brazilian government into a geopolitical straitjacket. While Western nations were demanding condemning votes at the United Nations, Brasilia had to tread carefully. President Bolsonaro visited Putin in the Kremlin just days before the invasion, not out of ideological love, but out of necessity. He was there to secure the potash needed to save Brazil's soybean crop. If Russia turned off the tap, Brazil's economy would wither, and global food prices would spiral out of control. This leverage explains a glaring anomaly in the Western sanctions regime. While the US and EU were aggressive in sanctioning Russian banks, oligarchs, and oil, they carved out massive, quiet exemptions for Russian fertilizer. The US Treasury actually issued guidance documents encouraging banks to facilitate Russian fertilizer transactions, explicitly stating that they were not sanctioned. Western leaders realized that they were trapped in a paradox. To punish Russia's economy fully would be to starve their own populations and trigger revolutions in the global south. Russia knows this. They know they are too big to sanction in the food system. They effectively collected a geopolitical rent, continuing to earn billions of dollars from the very nations supplying weapons to Ukraine. But the weaponization of wheat and fertilizer is only the short game. The long war is being fought on a timeline measured not in months, but in decades, and the primary driver is climate change. Most nations view rising global temperatures as an existential threat. Russia views them as an economic opportunity. It is one of the few countries on Earth that stands to be a net beneficiary of a warming planet. As the equator becomes too hot for human habitation, and the traditional breadbaskets of the American Midwest and Southern Europe dry up due to aridification, the Goldilocks zone for agriculture is moving north. It is moving directly into Siberia. Russia possesses the world's largest reserve of untapped arable land. There are millions of hectares of non-black earth regions that were previously too cold for intensive farming, but are now thawing. The permafrost is retreating, revealing new frontiers for wheat, corn, and soy. Russian state planners are not ignoring this. They have published national adaptation strategies that explicitly detail how to exploit this climate bonus. They are building new ports in the Arctic Ocean, the Northern Sea Route, which will allow them to ship this grain to China faster than ever before. The vision is terrifyingly ambitious, a future where the United States is a drought-stricken, declining power, while Russia becomes the agrarian superpower of the 22nd century. This shift in the physical geography of food production is accelerating the alignment of the axis of authoritarians. China, with its 1.4 billion people and limited water supplies, knows it is structurally food insecure. It needs a reliable partner that is immune to U.S. naval blockades. Russia is that partner. We are seeing the integration of Russia's land and resources with China's capital and technology. Chinese state-owned enterprises are leasing massive tracts of land in the Russian Far East. They are building grain terminals and railways. This is not just trade, it is a strategic merger. It creates a fortress economy across Eurasia that can feed itself, fuel itself, and arm itself, completely independent of the Western-controlled oceans. The implications for the West are profound. For 80 years, American power was underpinned by its ability to feed the world. Food aid was a tool of soft power. American wheat won the Cold War just as much as American missiles did. But if the U.S. loses its surplus due to climate change, if the Ogallala Aquifer runs dry and the California Central Valley runs out of water, and Russia simultaneously expands its production, the balance of power shifts decisively. Food becomes the ultimate hard power asset. A world where Russia controls the grain and the fertilizer is a world where Moscow holds a veto over the political stability of every food importing nation. We are moving from a world of free trade in food to a world of mercantilist hunger, where calories are allocated based on political loyalty. The West is slowly waking up to this reality, but the response has been sluggish. European nations are trying to diversify their suppliers, looking to Canada and Morocco, but you cannot diversify away from physics. The soil quality in Ukraine and Russia is unique. The fertilizer reserves in the Urals are irreplaceable. The geography of the planet has dealt Russia a winning hand in the game of resources, and while they may be fighting a messy, brutal war of attrition in the mud of the Donbass today, their eyes are fixed on the horizon, where a warming planet promises to hand them the keys to the global food system. The true danger of the weaponization of wheat is not just what Russia does, but how the rest of the world reacts to it. Fear is contagious. When a superpower demonstrates that it is willing to use starvation as a tool of statecraft, every other nation acts to protect itself. We are seeing the domino effect of food protectionism. It started immediately after the invasion. India, the world's second-largest wheat producer, saw the panic in the markets and banned exports to protect its domestic population. Indonesia, the world's largest producer of palm oil, banned exports of cooking oil. Malaysia halted chicken exports. In total, over 30 nations erected trade barriers on food in the last 3 years. This is the death knell of the era of globalization. For 40 years, the world operated on a just-in-time food system. Countries didn't bother stockpiling grain because they assumed they could always buy it on the open market. It was efficient, it kept prices low, but it was fragile. Now we are moving to a just-in-case world. Nations are hoarding. China has quietly amassed the largest grain reserve in human history, holding more than half of the world's wheat and corn stocks. They are preparing for a future where global trade breaks down completely. For the average citizen in the West, this marks the end of the era of cheap food. We have lived through a historical anomaly where food was so abundant and cheap that we spent less of our income on it than any generation before us. That anomaly is over. The combination of the Russian blockade, the fertilizer crisis, and the rise of protectionism means that the baseline price of calories has permanently shifted upward. We are entering an age of agflation. This isn't just about paying 50 cents more for pasta. It is about the structural impoverishment of the working class. When food prices rise, discretionary spending collapses, the economy contracts, the standard of living falls. This scarcity creates a dangerous feedback loop between the state and the citizen. As resources become tighter, governments become more desperate to control what remains. We're already seeing the early signs of food rationing disguised as environmental policy or public health initiatives. But when governments can no longer provide the basic necessities of life at a price people can afford, they inevitably turn to their final option. They stop trying to create wealth and start trying to seize it. History shows that when an empire faces a resource crisis it cannot solve, it turns on its own citizens to fill the gap. It happened in Rome during the grain crisis of the 3rd century. It happened in the Soviet Union during the liquidation of the kulaks, and it happened in the United States during the Great Depression. In 1933, the United States was not facing a food shortage, but a money shortage. The government had printed more paper currency than it had gold to back it. The economy was collapsing, and people were losing faith in the banking system. They started withdrawing their gold, the only real wealth they had, and hiding it in their homes. They were protecting themselves from the government's mismanagement. President Franklin D. Roosevelt could not allow this. He needed that wealth to recapitalize the state. He didn't ask nicely. He didn't offer a fair trade. He used the Trading with the Enemy Act to declare a national emergency. On April 5, 1933, he signed Executive Order 6102. It was a decree that shattered the illusion of property rights in America. It made it a federal crime, punishable by 10 years in prison, for a private citizen to own monetary gold. It forced every American to turn in their gold coins, bullion and certificates to the Federal Reserve. In exchange, they were given paper dollars that Roosevelt immediately devalued by 40% a few months later. It was a bait and switch. The government confiscated the real wealth of the nation and replaced it with a depreciating IOU. Most people today believe this was a one-time event, a quirk of history that can never be repeated. They look at their 401ks, their Bitcoin wallets, and their real estate deeds, and they feel safe. They believe the Constitution protects their property. But the legal machinery that Roosevelt used in 1933 has not been dismantled. It has been strengthened. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, gives the president sweeping powers to freeze and seize assets during a national emergency. In a world of digital finance, the government doesn't need to send agents to raid your safe. They just need to press a button. In the next video, we're going to tell the full, uncensored story of the Great Gold Seizure. We will walk you through the secret prosecutions of the 1930s, the legal loopholes that the ultra-wealthy used to escape the dragnet, and the terrifying specific clauses in modern banking law that allow for bail-ins where the bank takes your deposits to save itself. You need to understand the precedent, because when the next crisis hits, the state will not ask for your permission. It will take what it needs. Smash that like button to keep the signal alive, and subscribe so you don't miss the history of the gold ban.